Okay, we are now going to look at the effect of an export subsidy. I want to think about the purpose of an export subsidy. An export subsidy is going to be where the government gives money to a firm in order to encourage them to sell to foreign consumers. This is part of usually an export-led growth strategy. We're going to use the market for steel. Let's change it, my yellow to something a little more bright. Using our demand and supply framework. So we have price on the vertical axis. We're going to have Q, or tons of steel on the horizontal axis. We're going to have a simple demand and supply curve, not even putting anything to do with elasticities here. What we're going to assume is that the firm is internationally competitive. And what that means is that when the country is open to trade, that our domestic firms will be selling to people overseas, which means that the world price will be higher. And the world price will be higher than the domestic equilibrium price. I'm not going to put in the domestic equilibrium price because we are starting from a point where we are internationally competitive. We're already engaged in international trade. So if I go across from the world price to the demand curve, what I'll find is I hit the demand curve. I'm going to drop down. Let me use my green lines. I'm going to drop down from that demand curve to the quantity axis. That's going to be my quantity demanded. And that's going to be my starting point. I'm going to use my green line. I'm going to drop down from the intersection of P world, that horizontal line representing the assumption of competitive international markets. And hit the supply curve. That's going to be my QS1. So the difference between what firms domestically make and sell and what consumers domestically buy is going to be exports. There's more production in the economy than there is consumption, and the reason is that we have somewhere that we can actually sell the product. So just to note that this is different from the graph looks exactly like the price floor situation. In the price floor situation, people would like to sell more at that price, but there are not enough consumers and there's nobody to sell to. With the international trade, you get that higher price. It's going to lead to, of course, with exports, a higher producer surplus than pre-trade. So what we have now is, suppose the government is even more interested in trade. They want firms to sell to overseas consumers. And one of the reasons for this may be governments might want, international currency. Okay, so I'm going to encourage firms to sell their products in the global market. And let's note here, this is the price plus the subsidy. So the government, you get the money from the international consumer, and then the government gives you an additional amount. The difference between this and a regular subsidy is that the government will only give you the money if you sell it to a foreign consumer. So therefore, the domestic consumer now has to compete not with the international consumer at PW, but the international consumer plus this additional return that the government is giving, right? And so very, very important, and I want to make a note of this, we're making the assumption of competitive markets. This is a false assumption in the market for steel, but we'll get back to what happens when we introduce more reality. We're looking at what happens if the government puts an export subsidy and the market structure is competitive, many buyers and sellers, and everybody is a price taker. Okay, all right, so now I'm going to, so the most important thing when you're looking at the effect of a policy is to figure out what are the new quantities and prices that are applicable. And let's use this other kind of blue color here. I'm gonna pick another blue color and down to the intersection of PW plus the subsidy and the demand curve. Let's actually see if I can bring that down a little more. This is going to be my new quantity now, QD2. And let's get another line. I'll go across from PW plus the subsidy on the price axis, hit the supply curve, bring it all the way down. And that will be the quantity new quantity supplied. It's going to be the new exports. So when I highlight a particular thing here, that's going to be a little bit different. We've had consumer surplus, we'd have producer surplus. We want to make a note of the area. Let's I'm going to use yellow, and I'll use my nice big highlighter. So what's going to be the area of the subsidy costs? Well, the per unit subsidy is going to be the difference between PW and PW plus the subsidy. And it's the new exports that is going to determine the subsidy cost base. So we have the subsidy cost being price. Let's see, it's price with the subsidy times exports, and the exports with the subsidy in place. It's be QS2 minus QD2, or the new exports. And so that's defined here by the rectangle. This is the base of the rectangle, the quantity that's going to be export. And this is the height, okay? Just want to note some other areas as well. Before the subsidy, the consumer surplus is going to be everything below the demand curve up to QD1 and above the price that domestic consumers pay, PW1. The domestic producer surplus, everything below PW, but above the supply curve. Remember, we're removing the cost, everything below the supply curve cost. And we're going to be really careful about that. And now, after, let's try to get another color that's kind of distinctive. After the subsidy, the consumer surplus, everything below the demand curve, but above PW plus the subsidy, that's the new price that the buyers pay. It's also the new price that sellers receive. So sellers receive PW plus the subsidy, and their producer surplus is everything beyond their cost, which is given by the supply curve. So I want to make a note. Everywhere you see a bold line separating or kind of forming some kind of, if I kind of go over all of my bold lines here, all those areas will need to be separately identified to do the welfare chart. Just kind of try to use a highlighter when you draw these things, identify producer surplus, consumer surplus, and if there's any subsidy costs or tax revenue, identify those separately with some highlighters, and you'll see where you need to get the separate areas. Right, so going to draw in letters just in the areas. And just note that this C applies to everything. It's a very big triangle. It's the original producer surplus. I don't need separate identifiers. As you can see, there's no bold lines separating that area, right? Okay. So I'm now going to do the welfare chart, but we can already think about, you want to even write down what you're thinking. This is an export subsidy. It's going to raise the consumer, the quantity supplied. It's going to raise the return to the seller. It's got to increase producer surplus. This is a policy that makes the foreign consumer more attractive than the domestic consumer. So we can imagine that this is going to lead to worsening of the consumer surplus. And of course, this is going to be a cost faced by the taxpayer. So I'm going to put some lines in here. going to want to have the consumer surplus. I'm going to want to have the producer surplus. And of course, I have to account for the taxpayer situation and the total surplus. Okay. All right, so let's put things that I need to kind of account for if I'm doing welfare analysis. I'm going to account for the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, the government welfare costs, and the total surplus. And we start off with exports. And the policy that we're evaluating is an export subsidy. And then we want to put our last column is the effect of the export subsidy. Right. So consumer surplus with exports, everything below the demand curve. That doesn't hurt to just keep going over it every time. Use my red here. Think below the demand curve, but above the price they pay. So that's going to be A, B, D. The price goes up to PW plus the subsidy, then consumer surplus will just be A, and that's going to be a loss of B, D. And I note, how am I figuring out the loss? I'm looking at areas of wealth or welfare or surplus that the consumer had before. We notice is that they had B and D and they've lost it. Any kind of loss in wealth or surplus is going to come in the effects column as B and D. You had it there, but it's not here. Producer surplus before was that area C, that's everything below PW. So let's kind of show that. Everything below PW, but above the supply curve, right? We're taking out the costs out of the revenue from PW times QS1. And so it's C, and then we're adding. We want to be really careful there. I did this video before, and I sometimes I wonder if I should share the mistakes I make with you just late at night. This is the new price that the firm is being paid, or the firms are being paid. And the surplus is everything above the cost, right? It's the revenue they're getting above the cost. So it's this triangle here. Initially, I had made a mistake and included area below the supply curve. So you want to be really careful. And I want to encourage you to not only do things on your own, but to also have a person that you compare your answers to. Anybody can make a mistake. All right, so I'm going to add B, D, and E, all there above the supply curve, but below that PW plus the subsidy, and of course the original C. So I've gained wealth. And you want to notice that the gain in wealth of the producers comes at the expense of the consumers. B and D are lost to consumers, but they're added to the producers. All right. And so let me just kind of highlight that in red. It's here, comparing the two columns, and this is something that's there, but it's not here. So it's a gain. So the policy causes the increase in wealth, and the government is not spending any money initially without the subsidy, right? And so what is the subsidy? We had highlighted that earlier. I'm going to highlight it again. Just let's pick a green color. And the subsidy is based on, here we go, the amount of exports and then the per unit subsidy. This is rectangle here, and it is a cost to the taxpayer. It's money being paid out. It's not money coming in. So we are going to put that in our welfare chart as a negative, and it's negative D, negative E, and negative F. And so we're going to put that in the effects column. It's didn't have a cost before, now you have it. So I'm going to talk about the fact that there are transfers to policies. Any policy, there are winners and losers. And what we can see here is that the loss to consumers, it's effectively a transfer. You make consumers poorer and you make the producers richer. And you see this transfer E, it's a transfer to the sellers, but from the taxpayers. So I'm going to talk a bit about income inequality here. Whether or not this increases income inequality depends on whether the firms and the workers in the firms, whether those people are poor or whether they're rich. You may have sellers who are poor and you may want to enrich them. This may be some kind of income support type of program. Consumers, we don't normally think of consumers, we just think of ourselves as consumers, could also be relatively rich, right? This could be some kind of higher end product. Suddenly people internationally want a product from a country. And what happens then is that if we are making the consumers worse off, making them pay a higher price, it could be that they are that wealthy. So you have to look at who buys this product, who uses this product to see, and who's selling the product. When we talk about taxpayers, who's generally paying taxes in the country? Is it poor people? Is it richer people? And what is it that the country is giving up in terms of just, this money could be used to some other program? Okay. All right. So what we expect to see is a loss of D and a loss of F. And let's go over here and kind of highlight again, how are we figuring out the total surplus? So we want to have multiple strategies to kind of check our answer. What we want is to look at what's the value of the product to society, the making and selling of this product or the consumption of this product, and net of the cost, over and beyond the cost. And so what's the value? The value up to QD1, and this is without the subsidy, the value of it to the economy is everything below the demand curve up to QD1, and then the value of this product to this domestic economy. The foreign consumer values it higher than the domestic consumer. And if the domestic consumer is a lower valued, we can as a society get a greater return by selling to the overseas consumer. So up to QS1, between QD1 and QS1, the value to the economy is the value in the international market. And so everything below the demand curve up to QD1, and then below the world price up to QS1, between QD1 and QS1 is the value. And of course, the cost hasn't changed. It's still the supply curve. The supply is coming from domestic. So it's AB here. Let's change the color. It's A, B, D, C. Now let's go to the price PW with the subsidy. And so an important thing to note here is that the value to the economy does not jump up to PW plus the subsidy when the government puts a subsidy on, right? The value, again, we're assuming no market failures, no externalities, there's no greater third-party benefit or something. That's what we're assuming here. So the value remains the demand curve up to QD1, and it goes from QD1 to QS1. It's still, the value is still the international market. Okay, so that money that's coming from taxpayers is literally being transferred to make producers richer, but it's not changing the actual value to the economy. So what's the now we're producing QS2. So you're going to have everything below A, B, DC, but we want to note that now we are going to have this extra cost. And remember, when we have a cost that's beyond the benefit, right? We have to subtract that cost. So we've produced up to QS1, and now we're going further, and we get we got to take that cost out. So now I want to talk about something that's a little less obvious because my chart is not quite correct. Okay, so let me change to this. I actually want to highlight this one. So if I look at this, I see that in my effects column, I have minus D minus F. And if I were to use my other strategy of figuring out TS, I would add up the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the government subsidy costs. And if I do this, I can see here I've got A, got B, and it doesn't appear anywhere else. It's interesting, come back to it. I've got D here, but I've also got a minus D here. So D will not show up down here. Got C, and then of course my E's also cancel. And then I've got the minus F. So what's actually happening there? What's happening is that I'm spending money, the taxpayer, that D is part of taxpayers. So the wealth that is created up to a quantity, if we just simply change the prices in terms of putting a price control or taxes or something like that, and income gets transferred around, as it did, we had consumer surplus. D was already created in the economy once we went up to QD, our total surplus, remember. I think I can erase something. So I'm gonna, let's see which color can I possibly use to try and highlight. Let me use the black. So what's the total surplus with the export subsidy? Well, up to QD, let's do up to QD1, the total surplus, everything below the demand curve, but above the cost, okay? So once we produce QD1, the wealth is there in the economy. It's the difference between the value and the cost to the economy. The distribution of how the wealth is distributed once that's created, the wealth is generated by the production and consumption. So that D, when we kind of raised the price there, it was literally that choice to transfer, is literally to transfer income from the consumer to the producer, okay? Or you could think of it as the taxpayer compensating literally transferring the subsidy. Actually, it's coming, if we look at how the subsidy cost is a transfer from the taxpayer to the firm. And so the consumer loses D. And so we have in the economy, the D is created, it gets lost to the consumer, and then you have this transfer payment from the government to the firms, but there's that D that's lost and that we don't recover in a sense, okay? And so we see that here, this D that's lost, it's lost in a sense twice. It's lost to the consumer and then it's lost to the taxpayer, and it's only recouped once, or it's only really generated once for the firm. Okay, and so this is going to be the deadweight loss of the export subsidy. And so we want to be kind of just notice something about the losses. The losses partially come from the fact that we're increasing Q beyond what the market values the product. The extra production that we have here is the cost of it, of obtaining it and putting it on the shelves somewhere in the world, is greater than the value to the economy, at least to the domestic economy, right? And so what's the value of export subsidy and why would anybody do it? I'm just kind of allude to it now. In non-competitive markets and in what we call repeated games. So think about the steel industry. We assume, and this is our analysis, we assume competitive markets, but the reality is the market for steel, it is a non-competitive market. There are very, very few steel companies in the world in terms of the companies with the huge infrastructure, high fixed costs to have created the capital, the equipment to be able to produce steel. And so in the context where you have an export subsidy, so we kind of assume here competitive markets, firms are price takers. The price is just given. The firm is going to get a subsidy from the government, but it's not going to change world prices. In reality, the subsidies given by international governments to very large corporations with huge market shares, because there's so very few firms, they will actually lower the price. And it has to do with the size of the individual seller. There's market power there. And so when they increase the quantity supplied as individual firms, the market shifts, right? So we're assuming competitive markets, one firm leaves or goes, it's just an individual firm, then it's neither here nor there. Okay, it doesn't affect the price, they're just too small. In these non-competitive markets with very few firms, they have large market shares, a subsidy to a company like that will lower the world price. Why do you want to lower the world price if you're a South Korea, or if you're a Japan, or if you're a China? The reason is that in the long run, if the pockets of your government are deeper than the pockets of the other government cannot indefinitely just keep sustaining those losses. You'd have to commit to that kind of strategy. And so there's a model of this, and what happens is it just think of the example that I like to think about is think about an airline. And this is traveling to Jamaica. Jamaica had a national airline, and it kind of keeps coming and going, this national airline. But at some point, some private sector person bought the airline. They were going to make a go of having a Jamaica national airline. And what did American Airlines do? American Airlines priced very close to cost. And so they were willing to do that until they drove the other company out of business. And then what did they do? Of course, then they increased the price. Okay. And so the assumption that we've made here with the competitive market looks like a bad deal for the domestic economy. But when you have very large firms, and you can increase your market share, if you can drive the other countries out of business, or the firms in the other countries out of business, then you will have greater, you have less, customers have less substitutes in the future. And so this was one of the arguments that was made to keep the auto industry in the US afloat, in fact, in terms of domestic firms. It's that they have this huge infrastructure. You have a lot of capital, right? And once that goes away, that's very hard to put back in place. Okay, so when you have large firms, sometimes we have to look at the longer term and say, what's the impact of this repeated game of doing this over and over again? Do we want all those jobs lost? But if you're going to do that, there has to be an understanding that there's a commitment of money to support this industry, and it may take a long time. And there was a case in Britain where there was a car company, and just after decades of subsidizing, they decided that we're just not going to indefinitely support this, because remember, you're supporting this as opposed to some other industry that might actually have a chance to be internationally competitive. And we're going to stop there. So try to think about if the government put in an export tariff. First, what would be the goal of that? And what would be the impact on quantity supplied, quantity demanded, and what would be the welfare effects of that? Again, under the assumption of competitive markets.